Hey, it's Tech. Welcome to Off the Cuff. Today, I wanted to talk about an announcement that Intel made last week. It was in connection with an earnings report where they did actually, match their earning targets for that quarter. I think it was quarterly. But they also made this announcement about tick-tock cycles, and it has some media outlets talking about things like, the death of Moore's Law, which you'll see come up again and again relatively on a regular basis. And like, is the computer industry in trouble? What's this mean for personal computers? That's actually what I'm going to talk about today, is what was tick-tock, what has Intel moved to now, and what does it mean for computers? So first of all, I want to talk about Moore's Law. Okay, so who is this dude Moore and what is his law? So Gordon E. Moore was one of the co-founders of Intel, and he made an observation in 1965 that every year the number of transistors in these processing units was doubling. And then in 1975, he revised his observation saying it looks like it's doubling every 2 years now. That has been generalized as Moore's Law, that every 2 years the transistor count doubles, or put in a different way, because of the way that they're also upgraded in other ways, every about 18 months, the power of a computer chip has doubled. And that lasted, Moore's Law was valid for about 40 years. It provided a great framework for research and development. It was targets for Intel to meet to make sure that every generation of processor, everything that was coming out for personal computers was better than what was before it. And that's what has led us to the personal computer revolution. Things that are cheap, like the processors that are in your smartphone or in your other devices, like all of these are a direct result of this R&D push to keep pace with Moore's Law. But then things started changing around 2012. Some of the parts of the CPU that they used to be able to improve were having trouble. For instance, clock frequency, like how many gigahertz a processor runs at. The Pentium 4 ran at 3.8 gigahertz. The most modern processor that I just put into my computer runs at 4 and can boost up to around 4.2, but still, like, that's not very much, because the Pentium 4 came out in the year 2000. So that's quite a long time for the clock frequency to really not have moved much. So what has happened is Intel has had to find new ways. So shrinking the transistors, which was something they were doing before, hit a wall with the techniques that they were doing. Bipolar junction transistors were phased out, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s, and we're in field effect transistors now, and then these field effects transistors kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and then we had to go to 3D field effect transistors, right, to keep making things smaller and more power efficient. And then we hit the 14 nanometer process, and Intel, trying to push down to 14 nanometers, missed their original deadlines. It was supposed to be with the Broadwell architecture mid last year. Broadwell was really only around for about 3 months before it was replaced by the next generation of Intel processor because it was so delayed. But I'm going to get to that in a minute. The other thing that Intel's been doing to increase the power has been doing things like adding a larger data path width. That's something that you'll hear as talking about this is a 32-bit processor or a 64-bit processor. It's essentially how much information can go into a processor in each cycle. So 32 bits, which is what the old Pentiums were, and there you still get some today, especially in mobile computers like cell phones and tablets. You'll find some 32-bit processors. A lot are now 64-bit. It's more efficient. It's about 4 times more efficient than 32-bit processing. And of course, 32-bit processors replaced the 16-bit processors that came before them, which had replaced the 8-bit processors that were before them. So it's been this progression for the CPUs to be able to do more work on each cycle by adding more data inputs to each thing. The other thing that they've done that you might have noticed is that there are more cores on each chip. I think right now, I think it's 18 cores on a chip. the high-end Intel Xeons, really huge amounts of core power on a single chip. And that helps increase the power and increase the transistor count, but we're still kind of stuck. We're actually getting to the limits of what silicon can do. Like, we need a new material, but I'm going to get to that in a minute. So back to tick-tock. In 2007, Intel announced that their chip production cycles were going to follow what they called tick-tock. So it's a 2-year cycle. A tick year is where they change the process. So that's when they do a shrink. So down from 65 nanometers to 44 nanometers to 22 nanometers to 14 nanometers. They're making the transistors smaller so they can fit more on the chip. And then on a talk year, they're going to change the architecture. So the design of the circuits themselves get updated on the talk year. So you start taking the same shrunk thing and you add more complexity, more circuits, new instructions, and do the old instructions more efficiently. So that was their tick-tock 2-year cycle. This year, last week, they announced that that's changing. What they're changing now to is a 3-year cycle, which follows the following pattern: process, architecture, optimization. Or in other words, you shrink things down using a new process, you update the architecture, and then you spend a whole year optimizing that. Now, that may seem like they're slowing down their production or they're not going to be improving as often, but this is actually a really good thing. The slowdowns to Moore's Law were first seen right around 2012. Things weren't progressing as fast as they'd hoped. And in fact, if you have a 2013 or even 2014 CPU, you are going to not get much performance increase jumping up to the latest versions of the computer. Couple that with the fact that the biggest buyers of CPUs are like data centers and large business clients, and they typically only upgrade every 3 to 5 years anyway. So while we want computers to keep getting more powerful, and this is kind of a warning flag saying that we're approaching some boundaries, that's not necessarily what's going to happen, because that optimization phase is really, really important. When they switch to a new process, let's go with the 14 nanometer process, the most recent one. Haswell was released in 2014, mid-2014. By the end of 2014, they had started getting really good yields on the Haswell 22 nanometer process. I have a couple of Xeons at work that are Haswell late 2014s, and they work really, really well. They have 12 cores on 2 CPUs for a 24-core machine. It's super powerful. Early on in the cycle, you can't get the yields that allow you to have 12-core machines. You're getting 4-core machines. You're getting 2-core machines. What happens is when they switch to these new processes, when they add a new architecture, it takes time for the factories to just dial in everything that's going on. And initially, the yields are really low. So when Haswell, the 22 nanometer architecture, was shrunk to 14 nanometers for Broadwell, which was supposed to be released mid-2015 or early 2015, Intel had a problem. They were not getting chips that were working. They were trying to produce 4 cores. All they were getting is 2 cores. So initially the Broadwells weren't having any i7 processors. The way that Intel works, by the way, is they have these dies that basically apply for every i7, i5, and i3 chip there, more or less. And then what they do is they make all these runs and they take the chips that come out and they test them. How many cores are working? How many of the instruction sets are working? How much of the cache is available? And they disable the parts that don't work, and then they run it through clock frequencies, see where it's stable, and that defines whether it's going to be an i3, an i5, or an i7, how many cores are going to be working, and what its clock frequency is going to be. They grade these chips. So when you get a high-end like the i7-6700K that I have, it could be limited right there, or it could be way more powerful than that. You just don't know. It's a probabilities game. So Intel knows that it's a probabilities game for how many of each of the different types of processors they get. And when their yields are low, they're not getting the high-end processors. They're not getting the ones that gamers want, that video professionals want, that servers want, supercomputers want. They're not getting those, right? And they're stuck with just the entry-level processors at that new thing. Then over time, the process gets smoothed out. They work out all the bugs and the kinks, and the yields start going up. They start getting more 4 cores than 6 cores and multi-cores on the Xeon side when they make that transition. But Broadwell was so problematic that it was only really around for 2 months, 3 months before Skylake came around, which was the next architecture. So Broadwell was a tick, Skylake was a tock. So it was a new architecture, 14 nanometers. They started doing it. It took them a while with Skylake to build up their yields enough to be able to get the 4-core powerful ones. It took until the end of the year before they could even release the more powerful ones, even though Skylake was announced mid-year. This is because of how long it takes. So what was supposed to happen is in the next couple months, actually, a new architecture called Kaby Lake was supposed to come out. Not architecture, process, sorry, which was supposed to be a 10 nanometer shrink. And a few months back, Intel said Kaby Lake 10 nanometer shrink is behind. It's not going to be shrunk to 10 nanometers. So instead, we're still going to release it a little bit late-ish, not much, but a little bit late. And what we're going to do is we're going to add in a little bit more of the features that we had wanted to put into Skylake, but couldn't get optimized in time, couldn't get them working reliably in time. So Kaby Lake is actually going to be the first optimization batch, and it's going to add some new instruction set. It's going to add dedicated 10-bit HEVC encoding and decoding, which makes it compatible with things like UHD Blu-ray and UHD streaming and HDR video, whereas the Skylake only has 8-bit HEVC encoding and decoding. So it's more limited, though the rest of the processor can decode close to real time for 4K 10-bit. I know I've tried. But it's this Kaby Lake optimization that's going to make that work really, really well. And then not this year, but next year, 2017, they're looking at doing the 10 nanometer shrink. And hopefully at that point, they will have figured out the steps. And so that's what things are going to be from here on out. So we do the shrink process, then we change and update the architecture to make things run more efficiently, more power, less like electric power draw. And then we optimize it. When our batches are getting high, we're getting great yields out of everything, then we're able to mass produce, bring it out to more people at less cost. And that's the key, is the optimization phase lets them bring these features out to more people for less cost, which means everyone benefits. Right now, if you go and try and look for a computer and you don't know what you're doing, you're going to be so lost as to what generation things are and what the differences in generations are. This is going to help smooth that out a little bit. It's going to bring the costs down marginally, but still down a little bit, give more power to more people. Because I mean, right now, if you're using an i3 or an i5, a low-end i5, you're basically have the power of a 2011 computer. Like, that's kind of slow. You want something more recent. So more people are going to be able to feel the benefits of the power going forward. Now, optimization has actually been happening for a while because even with Haswell, it was mid last year that the first 6-core Haswells were coming out. Their yields were high enough. Now it just happened to overlap with Broadwell and Skylake. But now the Intel's just pulling that overlap apart, and so they're updating the process at specific factories in a little bit longer schedule so they can keep the yields up and the costs down for everyone. So what does that do for Moore's Law? Well, as I said, back in 2012, they noticed it was slowing. And even last year, Gordon Moore himself said it looks like it's essentially going to be completely irrelevant within the next 10 years. It's gone completely. But even now, like when you compare the best Skylake processor that's on the market to the best previous 2-year-old processor, they are so close to each other. It's about 5% difference in power. Skylake is 5% better. That is not much difference. So is Moore's law dead? More or less. Is it something to be worried about? Not really. Here's the thing. Since Moore's law is dead, effectively, it doesn't mean R&D is going to stop. It just means we have new benchmarks to go. We're pushing the limits of what silicon can do. So the element, right now, the 14 nanometer process, it's about 120 silicon elements per transistor, or per element in a transistor. That is not very many atoms. That is a tiny amount of atoms. And as you start going smaller, you start getting under 100. You're starting to scale the order of magnitude where you're trying to approach single atom transistors. And there are research groups working on that. There are other people looking at things like carbon nanotubes that are hopefully going to be able to replace silicon, because at this point we are pushing the limits of what physics tells us. Once we get past and get on the same order of magnitude as single atoms, we're starting to deal with quantum effects. Now, modern field effect transistors rely on quantum tunneling, where charge will jump from one path to another without having to go over an energy barrier. It just tunnels through the barrier, and that's a different topic for a different day. So we rely on quantum physics now, but the quantum physics that we're talking about later, the mechanics, starts becoming unpredictable once you start hitting the handful of atoms stage. And getting that predictable, getting that something that we can rely on, is going to be more of a challenge moving forward in the future. But basically declaring that silicon is dead or dying means that all R&D should be pushed away from silicon into something, or whatever is next. Maybe it's a brand new something, I don't know, right? And that's the point, is that the research has to be done in order to improve it, and it only gets done when we say, okay, what we've been relying on for years, we can't rely on anymore. So let's find something new, let's find something better, let's find something more powerful that can keep pushing us forward into more computing power in the future. Let me know what you think about Moore's Law and about the new end of the tick-tock cycle for Intel that lasted for 9 years. What your thoughts are on processors in the comments below. If you are new to Tech Laboratories, go ahead and click subscribe. And until next time, I'm Tech Adams saying keep thinking, and thanks for watching.